If you're joining us from outside of Thurston County or outside of Washington State, we would encourage you to connect with your local conservation district. So conservation districts were initially formed in the 1930s as a local, place, and community-based response to natural resource concerns. Nationally, conservation districts provide incentive-based programs, education, and non-regulatory technical assistance that make it accessible and more affordable for private landowners and community members to implement conservation on their landscapes or in their homes. So all of the work that we do is non-regulatory and voluntary. And because conservation districts are locally oriented, we're able to build our programming and offerings around the needs of our specific local community. And so this workshop is a part of that local response to local needs. So this past fall, we were awarded a grant from the Washington State Conservation Commission through the Sustainable Farms and Fields Program. This grant is focused, this program, the Sustainable Farms and Fields Program, is focused on making it easier and also more affordable for farmers and ranchers to implement climate-smart practices and projects that increase carbon sequestration and reduce greenhouse gas emissions on their landscapes. So over the last several years, we've had a strong interest from our community in learning more about hedgerows specifically and how to incorporate those on working lands. And so through this funding source, the Conservation District has been able to partner with local experts, Erica Gutman and Cameron Dunn, who are here this evening, to hold multiple educational webinars and offer hands-on demonstration workshops. And we even have a podcast episode out there, all about hedgerows. So it's very exciting. And so without further ado, I want to take a few minutes just to introduce our local experts and presenters. So our first presenter is Erica Gutman. So Erica, many of you may know her. She has been a hands-on environmental educator for over 37 years and has led Washington State University Thurston County Extension's water resource work since 1997 through research and publications, classroom, online, and field-based instruction, and engaging thousands of community volunteers in learning through hundreds of stewardship projects, including on-the-ground ecological restoration and green stormwater infrastructure installation. Erica has led trainings for a variety of professional and general audiences on a range of topics related to protecting and conserving water resources and habitat, including rain garden design and construction, other green stormwater management techniques, sustainable landscaping practices, and ecological restoration. Erica has also authored and contributed to numerous publications and videos to help community members protect water resources, including handbooks on rain gardens, residential low-impact development, shoreline revegetation, winter twig identification, and videos guiding residents in building rain gardens in the Pacific Northwest. So to empower landowners to successfully implement hedgerows to achieve multiple on-farm benefits, Erica co-developed an online hedgerow toolkit and for rural and working lands, and co-authored a definitive hedgerow guidebook that's entitled Hedgerows for Rural and Working Lands in Western Washington, a how-to handbook. It's very well done, I will add. And Erica has successfully integrated hands-on education for landowners with implementation of demonstration projects such as rain gardens, and has designed over 60 of those just in our region alone. She's also worked on permeable pavements, ecological restoration for freshwater and marine shorelines, degraded prairie habitat, and other critical areas. And she has a master's degree in ecological restoration with a focus on the Salish Sea near shore. So as you can imagine, we are excited to have her here today because she is a wealth of information. We also have Cameron Dunn is our other presenter this evening, and we're excited to have him as well. He has been with Native Plant Salvage Foundation. He has been their learning and outreach coordinator for 2.5 years and worked with Erica to co-develop the Hedgerow how-to handbook and the accompanying template. He has an educational background in design, and after nearly a decade in tech working as a systems architect and process designer, he joins the COVID career pivoters and is eager to continue working in citizen science, environmental restoration and education, or conservation technology. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and I'm going to hand it over to our presenters to take it away.
All right. Thank you, Kiana. Thank you, Jay. All right, folks. Well, thank you all for coming. Wouldn't it figure that tonight is actually the first beautiful night we've had in weeks, and here you are in front of a webinar. I'm so sorry, but thank you for joining us. So I'm going to just start with a quick overview of what I'm going to be covering tonight so we know where we're heading. So first, I'm actually going to very quickly recap some of the key ideas that we covered in November's part 1 webinar. And I'm hoping that some of you were able to participate in that or that you were able to watch that webinar subsequently. But the bulk of today's focus is actually going to be on how we create an implementation plan, and especially the steps in the site assessment section. So we're kind of chopping up the whole process of designing and installing and caring for hedgerow into multiple chunks, and we're going to have multiple hedgerows to accompany that so that we'll take it in manageable pieces. And along the way, as we go through this little agenda that I've popped up here, we're going to take a break for questions now and then. So feel free to just start putting your questions in as they occur to you, and then Cameron will ask me those questions or answer. He'll ask himself questions too as we go. And then, of course, if you have any problems hearing me or something got blipped out, you need me to say it again, or I went too quickly, go ahead and in the Q&A, just say you need some help with something, and Cameron will interrupt me immediately, and we'll go back and make sure everybody gets that. Okay? Everybody on the same page, I hope. Great. All right, so before we jump into that content, as I said, I want to provide some quick background for those of you who have not yet explored our online content or who didn't participate in the previous webinar. So we at both Washington State University Extension here in Thurston County and our nonprofit affiliate, the Native Plant Salvage Foundation, have been working with Thurston County's stormwater program intermittently for a few years to create what now is being called our Hedgerows Toolkit. And we will be sharing little sections of that as we go through our talks today. I just want to give you the background that we started this from a perspective of supporting agricultural producers and creating narrow buffers to protect water resources. And then our passion and for the power of hedgerows grew exponentially as we started to explore what hedgerows are and what they can do in our region. So again, just to be sure we're on the same page, we have an abundance of resources in this new toolkit to help you get started. And they're all found at our Hedgerows website through our WSU site. And you can just Google WSU Hedgerows if you forget any of this stuff, and you'll get yourself there. So this how-to handbook that Kiana referred to is the backbone of the toolkit, and it's the starting place for learning about hedgerows. And we are going to be making more tools available on this Hedgerows Toolkit site all the time, including by documenting this workshop series and ultimately creating case studies for all the Hedgerows installations that we end up doing as part of our hands-on education. These are the components of the toolkit you can see here from the web page on the left-hand side. And as I said, Cameron, I'll show you a few sections of these as we go through our talks today. In the first webinar, I highlighted some of the resources in the toolkit pretty extensively, so I'm not going to spend any of our time on that today. And really, if you haven't checked it out yet, just go there after the webinar and explore it for yourself. Again, you can just Google WSU Hedgerows and you will find a path. In our first webinar in this series, early in November, I detailed the options for how we might define a hedgerow, including the long history of those created in the UK and Europe, and examples closer to home of the different types, and all the scientific studies documenting the abundant ecological and agricultural benefits of hedgerows. I want to reassure all of you who live in smaller lots and are urban and suburban areas that hedgerows can work their magic on any size landscape. And although you could define a hedgerow in a lot of ways, and just to kick things off, I created this very basic description, which is that a hedgerow is a multi-species narrow planting designed to weave together over time to create a narrow buffer, screen, or boundary while providing many benefits to the land and landowner or resident, as the case may be. All right, so the bottom line is that hedgerows are narrow buffers that can be designed for many benefits and goals. They can be sized or shaped to fit in many different kinds and sizes of landscapes, and they include a mixture of woody plants and herbaceous plants, or just woody plants, or even just herbaceous plants. So lots of plant choices within a hedgerow. In our handbook, we lay out the science behind each of the primary benefits, which typically correspond to a specific goal and some kind of specific planting guideline. And here are the goals that we focus on. Again, I'm just going to do a recap of these goals that we explored in detail in part 1. So if you missed the first webinar, you can find it on our website under the video section. And I go through in detail how all of these goals, why the hedgerow provides for all of these goals. in various ways. So the first one that we call it crop productivity, windbreaks and more, followed by livestock exclusion and livestock shelter, habitat for wildlife, pollinators and natural pest enemies, management of dust and odors, interception of pesticide drift, flood management, conservation of topsoil and water, protecting local waterways and enhancing fish habitat, and what we call close to home benefits. And what's inherent in all of these is mitigation for climate change. And even though we've developed planting plans that favor each of these specific goals, you can see that for most of these, when you aim for one goal, you're probably going to see multiple benefits almost no matter what you do. So the first step in our implementation plan is actually to define your goals. And that's really the first step in any planting project. In our first webinar, again, we talked about the myriad benefits of hedgerows in great detail. And although it's easy to see from the laundry list that I just showed that there's going to be a lot of co-benefits, what we really want is for you to define your primary goals. And then that's going to help you in your next steps. And that's the way we've structured our toolkit and all the accompanying ready-made planting templates to support the primary goals. Goals are going to drive where you place the hedgerow, how big you make it, and the characteristics of the plants that you end up choosing. Let's look again at these 9 benefits of or possible goals for a hedgerow that I showed a minute ago. As Cameron and I started to consider actual hedgerow design, we realized that we could lump a few of these. So management strategies for wind, dust, and odors share design requirements. So we combined those goals into a single template. And you can see then how each template notes the plant characteristics that were required for these goals so that folks can then take our templates and actually customize them for themselves. I'll give you one more example of that. We also noticed that there were a bunch of goals related to water protection, flooding, erosion, and so on. So we grouped those together and we created what we called a riparian block template. And again, we described the key characteristics of the plants that are going to be required for these benefits. The remaining goals that we addressed were through the template we call our living fence template, our pesticide drift interception template, the habitat block template, and the one we call close to home or top picks, which is kind of like all those benefits you could get around your home site, and also sort of some of the favorite plants for hedgerows if you can't pick for yourself and you don't have any particular goal in mind. And just a side note that we're updating all of our resources as we go. So the templates from last fall's Helsing Junction hedgerows planting are now available on our website. And actually Cameron's devised 2 sets of those. One is what we actually put on the ground and another is a less dense set that he hasn't quite put on the website yet. But we're going to be sharing those as well as the designs that we create from the Oyster Bay Farm planting that we're going to be installing this coming Saturday, March 16th. So keep checking back for new things. So on this coming Saturday at Oyster Bay Farm, the farmers Nate and Melissa are going to discuss their hedgerow goals in quite a bit of detail. But water quality is one of their big goals. So here's the site where we'll be working. And you can see that there's a stream that actually runs between these hedgerow lines. This is where the hedgerow is going to go here on these areas that have been tarped to try to kill the weeds before we do the planting. So that stream that comes down here ultimately connects out here into Oyster Bay. And so you can see then that these hedgerow lines follow that all the way along until it leaves their property and runs underneath the road. And again, it basically comes out into the bay. And so what's going to happen is that all of the runoff adjacent to that stream is going to be intercepted by the hedgerow. And that runoff, it does include manures from their free-range animals. So all those manures and other impacts from the farming operation are going to be filtered and intercepted and cleaned up before they get to the stream and ultimately out to the bay. So after you've established your goals, you're going to need to create a basic plan for how you're going to design, install, pay for, and care for your hedgerow. And early on in this process, we advise you to address this question, which is how much of it can you do on your own versus how much do you need professional assistance for, or maybe some combination of the two. So if you're an agricultural producer, chances are that you're going to qualify for some kind of public funding and likely for public technical assistance too, from your local conservation district or the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or both. So it's important to explore these publicly accessible options early, because there may be specific minimum guidelines that you would need to follow to get that funding or assistance. And also the technical assistance could impact your project's design. There are also private grants and many more funding resources that we outline in the funding resources section of the Hedgerows Toolkit. Even if you receive public or private funding, you're almost certainly going to be doing some work on your own, or maybe with a little help from your friends. And in the budget section of the handbook, we describe various budget stretching options and other ways to save money as you go. So we're not going to get into that much today, but just be aware that those resources exist. All right, that was a little detour from talking about creating an implementation plan. So let's get back to all the steps in creating an implementation plan. We start with what I'm calling step 1A here, and that is figuring out how big to make your hedgerow. So once again, your goals are going to determine the size, both in terms of its length and its width and even its height. So let's just consider length for a moment. Length is going to be typically determined based on what you're trying to protect or exclude, while still maintaining key access points as you might need to for operations. So here, for example, is a hedgerow that runs across a pasture and a hayfield, and on one on either side. And it's actually protecting a stream. Believe it or not, there's a stream underneath all of those trees. So this hedgerow is going to be shading the stream. It's also filtering from any livestock impacts, and it's also excluding the livestock from entering the stream. So it's got a lot of goals, this particular hedgerow. So with all of that in mind, you can see that it's going to have to be as long as whatever it takes to for that stream to pass through that particular landowner's property across that agricultural field. And just to make sure that it's filtering and keeping the cows out and shading it's actually a fish-bearing stream, shading it out for the fish and so on. All right, so as far as width goes, again, we're talking about narrow buffers, and the minimally effective widths are generally at least 10 to 15 feet wide, although narrow is definitely possible. And the whole point is that hedgerows can provide a lot of benefits within a very narrow space, thereby minimizing how much land is taken away from other priorities. And sometimes over time, the footprint will still remain narrow, but the canopy will be quite extensive. So here is an example of that. This is my backyard hedgerow, and you can see how the canopy kind of reaches over. My hedgerow is only 8 feet wide on the ground, but up above it, it's probably good, 12 to 15 feet wide in some sections. So that would be a question of plant choice. If you needed to both keep it narrow on the ground as well as narrow above, you just would be sure that you didn't have plants that had such a spreading canopy. All right, so hedgerow height might be very tightly prescribed by the goal that you are working toward, or it just might vary over the length of your hedgerow, with occasional very tall plants interspersed with lower plants. Can you think of cases where you may need a minimum height for your goal? Where might you need to have a minimum height for your hedgerow goal? Can you think about that for a sec? I'm sure that shade came to mind for many of you, and that is definitely one of the goals where height is critical. And in this case, we're talking about shading out a stream, and so we need to have plants that are able to reach up over that stream and completely cover it during particularly during the summer months. So another place where you might need to have plants of a particular height are what we call shelter pockets. And these are little add-ons to a hedgerow that provide support for livestock, where they can take refuge both in the summer and the winter. And we have that as part of our hedgerow toolkit as well, these little shelter pockets. So you might need to have specific kinds of tall trees that can provide the necessary height to provide shade or to give refuge from driving rain, for example, for the livestock. Certain hedgerow designs have very clear height requirements to be effective, such as certain wind blocking or dust blocking designs. And so these kinds of designs would require vegetation that could quickly achieve a minimum height to achieve those goals. Or on the flip side, you may need plants that have a maximum height, below a certain threshold so as not to shade crops or interfere with the function of a high tunnel or some other part of the farm's infrastructure. Next, you'll determine the best placement for your hedgerow. So now we're to step 1B. So you want to place your hedgerow to maximize its capacity to support your goals. And as you consider these, here are some of the basic questions that we have to investigate. First of all, you need to think about where you can put your hedgerows so that you have access to irrigation, because you're going to need to make sure that for the first 2 growing seasons, there's some form of water every now and then during the hot months. Because your hedgerow is a long-term investment, you want to ensure that its planting is not in conflict with crop space in the future. So again, we're going to think about shade. Tall or tree-based hedgerows can provide a great wind block for crops and high tunnels, but they also must be placed far enough away to avoid casting shade on either of those things. You also need to site the hedgerow so that you won't impede air circulation that your crops need, or that condensation that may be generated from the hedgerow won't negatively affect crops. And pay attention to the prevailing wind directions. Your hedgerow is ideally placed to provide buffer and support to the beneficial insects and overwintering organisms that you may be trying to attract into your crops. These are all just examples of things to think about depending on your goal. Once again, some hedgerow goals require paying attention to specific design guidelines that require placement in relation to the operations or the issue that you're mitigating, such as dust or odors, which have to be placed in a certain distance from maybe some kind of an animal enclosure where there's odors being generated and so forth. You need to ensure that the hedgerow is not going to impede equipment access or access that can be provided as needed. So for example, in the hedgerow that we installed in November at Hedgerow Junction, we designed in these 8-foot access points every 60 feet. And these are designed so that tractors can move across the field pretty easily, because this is almost a 600-foot hedgerow. And the other reason is it's that they need to sometimes move irrigation lines back and forth across the field. So this would allow for equipment to be moved in the middle of the hedgerow and not necessarily have to go all the way around. And it's not really, it's such a small access point that it's not going to impact the effectiveness of the hedgerow for its prescribed goals. You might want to consider aesthetics, including views you do and do not want to obscure. So you might want to see your horses, for example, but maybe not so much their manure management system. And hedgerows planted for wildlife, pollinators, and natural pest enemies might be more effective with some connections to other green spaces, whether it's other hedgerows or nearby natural areas such as forests or wetlands. And so by creating proximate corridors for the organisms you're trying to attract into the fields, you might maximize both the species diversity of those beneficial organisms and increase the overall numbers of beneficial organisms coming into your crops. So let's just use that as an example. If attracting pollinators and natural pest enemies is our goal, we would be looking at our habitat block template for that, for example. And then when we consider placement, we need to evaluate where it's the best place to put the hedgerow in relation to what kind of crops we are growing. So maybe the field edge would be best. Again, that might have that connectivity to other green spaces, but maybe depending on what we're doing, we might want to intercrop between the rows so that we have a hedgerow kind of right in the middle of the operation, and then the beneficial organisms are super close to the crops. Or we might want to put it really close to a high tunnel so that we can try to import some of those beneficial insects into that space, or maybe further away so as not to shade it. So these are the kind of trade-offs you have to think about, for example, with that particular goal. Here's another example with regard to protecting water quality. So do you place the hedgerow at the edge of a waterway, for example, so that it can filter right there as before things come into the waterway? Or perhaps it's better to put it really close to where the sources of runoff are so that it can have more time to filter as that runoff moves across the fields. And then you would want to size it appropriately so that it's sufficiently large to address whatever problem you're trying to treat, or maybe protecting whatever resources there are in the waterway that you're trying to protect. Now, there are other questions that you might have about how to protect the resources, and these might have nothing to do with the placement. You might have to wait until you're thinking about choosing plants. So for instance, depending on the issue, maybe you need to choose plants that are really great at filtering or that will support aquatic habitat, even if it's from the land. Or maybe you need some kind of strong erosion control. And finally, you might need plants that have the characteristics to ensure that they survive and perform in certain conditions, such as saturated soils. So I'm trying to have you think about these things in little groups, but at the same time, you're going to always be thinking in terms of the thing that's coming next. And the point here is that size and placement doesn't address everything. Some of those questions might have to wait until later. So you might have to put a hedgerow where it's not ideal for filtering, but then your plants may be able to make up the difference. Okay, let's take some questions that have arisen to this point, if we can.
So we have one question right off the bat. Can you clear out undesirable riparian vegetation and underplant more desirable species for your hedgerow under mature trees?
Yeah, that's a great
That's from Mary
question.
Anderson.
Hi, Mary. That's a great question. And I think, yes, the only thing you'd want to be careful about would be, impacting the roots of the mature trees. But typically, a lot of the invasive species are not so deeply rooted, or you could do some sheet mulching. Again, you'd want to be careful not to smother existing roots of big, tall trees if that's what you're trying to retain. But it's a wonderful idea to create layers of vegetation underneath those trees that can do the heavy lifting of water quality protection in the place of the monoculture of the invasive species. I'm hoping that answers the question sufficiently, but you can hit me up again if you want some more.
And this reminds me a little bit, Erica, of what we talk about in the handbook, which is when you're planting something early on, you may be planting plants that need sun but are gap fillers for now. And as that hedgerow grows, they will be shaded out, and you might later on replace that with understory planting over the age of the hedgerow.
Right, right. In this case, it sounds like there might already be shade, but that's a really good point that sometimes you've got an invasive species, you need to clear this up before you plant, but they might be right back unless they start getting shaded out too. And again, you can change things over time, or you can use the plants for your backbone species that can be adaptable to both sun and shade, because there's plenty of those too. I think Linda
No other
Boyer had.
questions? Oh
I
yeah,
think
Linda earlier commented about seeing information about trees doing better if planted in a square hole, and Mary Anderson actually backed that up, saying that they thought it was about how the roots will grow through the side of the hole versus where in a round hole they might stay wrapped around and could eventually girdle. Yeah.
Interesting. That's very, very, very interesting. What about misshapen, weirdly shapen holes like I always dig?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
I've gone ahead
can...
and shared the poll results. I think everybody should be able to see that. As expected, lots of folks from Thurston County. Next, somewhere else in Washington, then King, Snohomish, or Kitsap, Mason, and Pierce. Over half of people hoping to create one on the hedgerow on their property, which is awesome. On top of just curiosity. Over half of people here are rural or agricultural setting. Again, great. Even though these can be planted in a small lot in a city, like Erica has, the handbook is really aimed for you folks with rural and agricultural land. And the most common things folks are hoping to learn are what are the steps involved in creating, which is great. That's what a lot of Erica's going over today. And then how best to choose the plants that are best for your needs.
Okay.
We'll reference that. Actually, Erica, I think, references that later on, but we will point you towards a few things. One is our sortable plant choice table, which has lots of characteristics that line up with the goals in our handbook. So if you know you're wanting to create a fence to exclude livestock, for example, you can actually sort the plants by whether or not they will create a dense, thorny boundary, for example. So I would definitely point you there, and also to look and investigate our own templates for sort of why we describe a little bit why we made the plant choices we did.
Great, thanks. And also, I just want to say, for those of you who haven't explored things yet or didn't attend the first webinar, we did share that link out, and I know many people probably didn't bother to watch a webinar. It'd be the last thing I'd want to do, to be honest. But I did just decide to jump right in and try not to repeat too much. So if you're confused already because I didn't give some background, there's plenty of time to catch up. All right, I'm going to move along then, because now we are actually to the heart of things. So that first little part was really just about how revisiting that we're goal driven, and how big and where to put our hedgerow primarily. And now we're into the site assessment step. So this is step 2, and it's a big one. It's really the bulk of what I'm going to spend my time tonight talking about. All right, so now that you've figured out where the hedgerow is going to go and how big it needs to be, what you're going to do next is this site assessment, where you take a full inventory of the characteristics of the site that are going to affect the hedgerow design, the plant selection, the site preparation tasks that are needed to get that planting off to a successful start, what issues you may need to monitor and manage, and how you're going to ensure that your planting is successful over the long haul. So I'm going to walk us through looking at some of the most important parts of the site assessment. All of these are detailed in the handbook, step by step. And just as always, big reminder, we have gobs and gobs of tools that drill down on all the site assessment steps outlined in the handbook so that you can go further. Basically, a lot of these resources serve as the appendix, but this is the living part of the document where, as we get more information, we keep adding on to it so that people have the most up-to-date information. All right, so sun exposure in the summer is tops on my list for ensuring that the hedgerow ends up with the plants that will thrive in the conditions that exist from the start. So exposure info is going to be critical for plant selection. We have that mantra, right plant, right place, and we don't want to force shade-loving plants into full sun and vice versa. In thinking about placement, you've already paid some attention to the prevailing wind direction a bit. Knowing how the wind moves across the site in different seasons is going to ensure the best placement and orientation of the hedgerow. And I think I already discussed that sufficiently, so I'm just going to move on to the other biggie, and that is understanding soils. That's at the top of the list right next to exposure, as far as I'm concerned, in site assessment. And there are quite a few key factors to know, but we're going to talk about the most critical ones. We're going to start with texture. So knowing how clayey, silty, or sandy your soil is going to allow you to assess the best suited plant species, and also the ideal plant stock types, by which I mean the capacity for using the less expensive stock like live stakes and bare root plants. For example, excessively droughty soils such as stony loams or gravelly sandy loams will have far less water holding capacity, and thus they might not be good sites for those cheaper but less resilient plants like the bare root plants that we're going to get lots of experience with on Saturday. So fortunately, the soils at Oyster Bay Farm, those of you who come are going to see this, where we're going to be on Saturday. They're primarily silty loam or even silty clay loam. So they have lots of those small silt and clay particles that give them great water holding capacity, although that does come at the expense of drainage. Nonetheless, we will be using a lot of bare root plants for this site, and they will handle those conditions great because the species we've selected are also okay in poorly draining soils. When you're looking at your soils, you absolutely want to see what's happening below the surface and really look at your own soils, including feeling the soils by assessing the texture by hand in the picture I just showed, and by digging a pit test to see how fast they drain. This is detailed in the handbook, how you do this. And once again, I'm going to point you to the resources on the Hedgerow Toolkit to take advantage of these one-stop shopping resources for investigating all your different soil questions. Included in those resources on the Toolkit website is the NRCS Web Soil Survey. So those of you who may remember back to the days when we had all these huge books that NRCS people used to schlep around with them and hand out to people, all that stuff is now on the web, and it's so much more effective, and of course a lot less paper. This web survey has so many details about the soils that are expected in your area based on soil mapping data, and you can get a customized soil report. So here's a picture of the 21-page report that Cameron generated a few days ago that's just all about what's to be expected at the Oyster Bay Farm on the Hedgerow site. There's several steps, but here's kind of the quick overview, which is that we put in here, you can see Oyster Bay Farm's address is there, and we then map the site. And then we see the composition of the soils that are on that site. And you can see then the predominance of the silty loam, and here the silty clay loam on that site by percentage, which then is reconfirmed by actual site assessment, looking at the real soils. But there are lots of other factors that the online tool is going to generate for you. So we really encourage you to explore that fully. And again, within the resources section, you can find the link directly to that at the top of that resources section, to that web soil survey. Another important factor in assessing your soils is the drainage capacity. Now, again, some of your drainage capacity will derive from the texture. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, those small clay and silt particles are going to drain more slowly. But many times your drainage is actually more affected by compaction. So compaction reduces the movement of water, air, and roots through the soil and results in poorer plant growth and more water runoff. So it's really important that you assess compaction. And if you find when you're digging your pit test that that things seem to be pretty compacted, then you're going to need to do a lot more assessment of that with some additional tools and maybe some support from our resource agency folks like Conservation District or NRCS. This is a really important step, because whether it's compacted from natural compaction, such as basal glacial till, or human caused from machinery or construction growing over it, these soils can be nearly impermeable unless we rip them. And since that would be a really big step in your site preparation, if you needed to do that, it's important that you know well in advance if that might happen, or maybe if you found out that your soils were super compacted in the spot you wanted to put your hedgerows, there might be even an opportunity to move that hedgerow to a different location without that kind of compaction, because things change over the course of a site. You're also going to want to make notes about what you've observed on the site during the rainy winter months to track how much surface water from occasional seasonal flooding may be occurring, and we call these the flashy condition, or whether there's actually high or perched groundwater, which would make the site consistently and regularly inundated in the wet months. The difference between these two is, again, going to affect your plant choices. For example, if you've just got occasional flooding that comes once a year, maybe once every few years, and that quickly recedes, it's not a problem for a great many plants, but there's a very much more restricted list of plants that are capable of withstanding months and months of saturation. And we'll see that at our upcoming Oyster Bay Farm site, which is shown here. And you can see all the little rivulets and the high groundwater kind of throughout this site. It's also possible to have both conditions. You may well have high groundwater in winter and the presence of a stream channel, and that's what's happening at Oyster Bay Farm. We've got the stream channel, and then kind of adjacent to it, it's not uncommon to have perched or high groundwater there too. These subsurface waters often go hand in hand. All right, so your project might require a bit more legwork if it could impact sensitive or endangered species. So if you're working closely to an area that has fish, again, you might need some help from the Conservation District or NRCS to navigate certain questions, such as soil disturbing activities that you might be doing that could impact the water quality and therefore could possibly be restricted. So the questions you would have to look at would be, how close are you trying to work to the stream in question? If there are fish present, then what kind of fish are actually there? Maybe it's not a fish that's actually a critical species. Maybe you're going to have your activities restricted to specific times of year to avoid potential harm to the stream. It's certainly possible to do soil disturbing activities near a stream, but you just have to pick the right time of year. And it could even be that you would need a permit from a wildlife agency. These are not all insurmountable hurdles by any stretch, but you want to make sure that you know what's coming and that you follow the rules appropriately, because A, we don't want to be hurting fish, and B, we don't want to get sideways with the regulators. And even if no fish are in an immediately adjacent waterway, that waterway is going to drain to another water body, and that might support fish and other aquatic species that need clean, clear, cold water. So you might just want to think about doing some kind of sediment control during the time that you're doing the soil disturbing activities. So in addition to impact to wild fish, here in Thurston County, you also need to be mindful of the potential impacts to our Mazama pocket gopher and the Oregon spotted frog. And again, our conservation district and our CS professionals can guide you through this assessment and any necessary mitigation that may be required. They're not insurmountable, but you need to be mindful of these potential species. Looking at the vegetation that's already on the site is critical for a few reasons. First, you may have invasive or aggressive plants such as reed canary grass that might need to be managed before you can plant. Even native plants can be aggressive. At the Oyster Bay Farm site, we're going to see that there are lots of native rushes that are super tough and would really slow us down in planting a dense patchwork of woody species. But the site prep that Nate and Melissa have done has weakened them considerably, so it's going to make our planting a lot easier. Also, just remember to kind of widen the scope beyond the planting footprint of what you're looking at. Even if the problem plants aren't in the way of the planting, you should assess if they will be sources of seeds or future trouble to your hedgerow over time. For instance, in one section of the Oyster Bay Farm planting that we'll do on Saturday, there are nearby Himalayan blackberries. And they aren't going to be inhibiting our planting on Saturday, but they will need to be addressed at some point to prevent them from getting tangled up in the hedgerow. The other reason to do an inventory of existing plants in the area is that they can be an indicator of what we call ecological identity on the site. So noting the existing species provides clues when creating your planting plan, and it might point the way to plants that are likely to thrive or plants that have been historically present. Existing vegetation might also provide clues about hard to see conditions, such as subsurface water that doesn't erupt to the surface. So if you think your site is dry and then you see skunk cabbage nearby, for example, you might then need to investigate this further. Even some of the invasive species you're encountering could offer clues regarding the site conditions. Some just grow in wet areas, some like really dry, well-drained soils, and so on. So just to kind of summarize this, some species are very particular about what conditions they'll grow in, and they'll give you more insight into your site conditions. And then you can also see what's doing well already and maybe plan to use more of the same of those native species. If you're planting a hedgerow in a riparian area, you might actually need to look further upstream or downstream to find areas of intact habitat if the site you're working on no longer has any older habitat. So you're also going to need to take a look at the surrounding land uses as part of your effort, and utilities are a key thing to assess in the early stage. Will there be any impact to underground power, water, gas, cable, or any of the other utilities that are placed underground during any of your preparation or even the planting? It's possible to pop a telephone line with a shovel. I have done it. So it might be required that you do some kind of a utility locate. You can do public locates or private locates if it's well out of the public right of way. And so that's going to give you an understanding of what is actually happening below ground and if there's anything you should be worried about. Also take note of overhead power lines, because that might be an issue with regard to tree height. If you end up putting taller plants into your system and there's big power lines up there. The other thing that a lot of farms have are utility easements. And those likely have defined setbacks that can't be encroached on. So especially if you're not the landowner and you're working on a site, a lot of farmers are renting property. You need to make sure you're aware of what all the legal requirements are in your vicinity. So irrigation infrastructure, including the wells, the main line, and all the other irrigation lines, is also important to take a look at. Again, you want to consider both the access to irrigation for establishing your hedgerow, but more importantly, in this case of the site assessment, is not impinging on the access to these critical parts of the sustaining operations so that your planting is not interrupting those bases. And then a final note in this laundry list of things to consider in the site assessment is the potential for historical or cultural resources. The Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation can actually assist you against accidentally disrupting cultural resources during any needed excavation. Typically, just planting some trees is not going to be an issue, but I believe the natural resources agencies are required to do this assessment regardless of the level of excavation involved. So we should all be responsible for this. in following the rules, because there's actually a legal responsibility to protect these resources. And it's not actually that hard to confirm that your site is either okay to move ahead on or that you might need some mitigation. So if you're getting technical assistance from your conservation district or NRCS agency staff, they can definitely assist you with this. But you can also reach out directly to the Department of Archaeological and Historical Preservation, and you can even submit a confidential request to learn if there are any known records on your site, or if you're even in an area of concern. There are many tools in the resource section, again, on the Hedgerows Toolkit site, including a pretty nifty little handout from the Natural Resources Conservation Service that explains this quite simply and shows the importance of doing this due diligence. Okay, well, believe it or not, we have made it through step 2, site assessment, and we're now to step 3, creating a planting plan. And the good news is that I'm not going to discuss this very much, because guess what? There's an entire chapter in the Hedgerow Handbook, and obviously creating the planting plan should be the subject of its own future webinar. So that one's coming down the pike in this series. But today I'm just going to give you a few basics to think about. Again, just kind of reminding everybody that our selection of our plants is driven by our goals and the site assessment information. And that's why we focused on our goals so much in our very first webinar back in November, and why now site assessment is the focus of this second webinar. The next thing is that we have got lots and lots of tools for you to help you every step of the way. Cameron mentioned the plant options table in the first webinar. Cameron showed quite a bit about how that works, and he's got a whole video on the website that explains how it works too. So from the plant options table to the chapter in the handbook to the ready-made planting templates, which you can customize. All of these tools go together to help you with the planting plan, but we are looking forward to diving into things a little bit more in detail in an upcoming webinar. Another few things I want to just kind of give you some basics about the planting plan, and that is that we start with what we call the evergreen backbone plants. Most of our hedgerows have got some kind of evergreen component, and you can probably guess why, because we're doing some kind of a buffer and a screen of some sort, and we'd like to make sure that there's foliage at all times of the year. So picking those evergreen backbone plants is really important. And also, we're just thinking about structure of the hedgerow, that we can add on herbaceous strips for various goals, including for pollinators, such as what I'm showing in this photograph here, or we can add on a herbaceous strip for filtering stormwater. And these herbaceous strips are generally cultivated outside the footprint of the hedgerow's woody species. So in the handbook, we talk quite a bit about this. You may not be your first goal or your first priority, but you can come back later and start adding these things on just to extend the benefits. And along those same lines, you should be thinking about maybe after some shade has been created in your hedgerow, that you may need to return to plant an understory set of species, so that as the plants move up and out, that ideally the plants you have at the lowest levels are both sun and shade tolerant. That's what we recommend in our templates. But as they get bigger, you might need to put in some other plants that are even shorter for just having that full line of layered coverage all the way down to the ground, which can provide so many benefits for wildlife and can filter out water pollution and so forth. And so as that hedgerow canopy expands up and out over time, we encourage that returning and thinking about understory species, even if it's just sword ferns. Okay, steps 4, 5, and 6. We're going to dispense with these pretty quickly in terms of our implementation, because again, I think with step 4, the number of plants on the row design, Cameron talked about that a little bit in the first hedgerow. We're going to talk, in the first webinar. We're going to talk about a little bit more this coming Saturday, but mostly I'm going to include that in a future webinar when we talk about that more planting plan focused webinar. In the first webinar, I talked a little bit about some of the budget resources that we have in the toolkit. Again, there's quite a few there, but it's such an important topic that I'd like to do a future webinar on that. Just a little plug for Saturday that Nate and Melissa are going to talk a little bit about how they're affording to do some of their improvements, including the hedgerow, but other on-farm improvements that that are protecting water resources as well. And then step 6, we come to site preparation. Again, this is a critical topic, and I'd already said back in November that we'd have yet another webinar on this, separate from this one tonight, because there's a lot that can be discussed in it. We will be showing a little bit of the site prep work on Saturday, and right now I'm just going to give you a few basics to keep in mind. So the first thing to keep in mind is that a hedgerow's success is tied directly to the amount of attention that's paid to the site preparation stage. There may be quite a few actions that are required on your part as you do your site preparation in order to make sure that the hedgerow planting will be successful. So you really need to take the time that's required in order to get the hedgerow off to a good start and get it thriving, including keeping competing vegetation at bay or making sure the soils are more friendly to the plants. So improper site preparation can result in ongoing battles with invasive species that dominate your new plants, which may be small, especially if you're trying to save money, you get little plants. And then you're going to have to spend more time on maintenance than you really should if you had done better site preparation. As well, you might have crummy soil that could have been improved with a little bit of time. And so the plants may fail to thrive because they're not happy in those conditions. So depending on what you need to do, it could take a few months to a few years. So, there could be a long lead time with the site prep, and I encourage everybody just to be patient with that. You are moving forward, you are doing the project, but you're saving yourself a lot of future headaches if you just kind of think of it that way. We always want to be designing for minimizing the future maintenance and the future problems. So at Oyster Bay Farms, Nate and Melissa used this geotextile tarping to weaken and kill the native and non-native pasture grasses, rushes, and sedges that are there in the line of the where we're going to be putting in the hedgerow. And then so that was actually pretty sufficient to weaken these that we're going to be able to plant on Saturday. What's going to happen over time then is that this row and this row and this row and this row are going to kind of weave together, and they're going to shade out that part in the middle. But meanwhile, Nate and Melissa are going to be mowing up here. And once they stop mowing, not only will these plants knit together more, but the plants that have rhizomes, like snowberries, for example, will reach across and start skirting in here and create more of a thicket. So ultimately, this area and this area will be a full thicket, as if we had planted it all the way across this whole expanse. And I think Cameron might show a little bit more of that when he talks about design in a minute. So step 7 is planting and mulching. And again, we're going to include this in a future webinar when we talk about creating the planting plan based on your goals and your site assessment. But there's gobs of info in the toolkit now if you want to go through that. There are a few things that I want you to consider, just since I'm leaving you without a lot of detail and keep saying we're going to do it later. So the first is timing. In our region, fall is an ideal time to plant because the soils are still warm enough that the plants can establish some roots before winter. And then Mother Nature helps water in the new plants, which dramatically reduces the amount of irrigation required the following spring and summer. But we can reliably plant through the winter months and into early spring here. And there are some advantages to doing that as well. So the planting we're doing on Saturday at Oyster Bay Farm, for example, is scheduled so late in the winter because we wanted to simultaneously miss the wettest part of the season, which, as we've seen from looking at pictures of their site, is a big factor in those saturated soil conditions. And believe it or not, it's going to be less wet than it would have been if we planted in, say, February. But also we are taking advantage of the availability of these less expensive plant stocks. In this case, it's the bare root plants. So today we just got almost 1,000 plants, bare root plants that just came by UPS. That's the other great thing. Very easy to schlep those things around. And we would not have been able to do that. Those plants are not available in the fall. So planting in the winter is critical if we want to take advantage of these inexpensive and sometimes easy to plant bare root plants. So again, on Saturday, we're going to do some hands-on learning. We're going to look at some different types of plant stocks. We're going to figure out how to plant those different types. I'm going to show you how to do that. And we're also going to show you how to plant in these saturated conditions with the different kinds of tools that we have. And so you will learn all of our best planting tips. We're also going to talk a little bit about mulch. We are passionate about mulch and all of the reasons for doing it. There's a whole giant section in the handbook about mulching and why it's our favorite thing. And we'll be showing the different kinds of mulching techniques. We're showing a little bit of those here in this inset photo. This is from our Helsing Junction planting that we just did in November, where we used a similar technique, but without the geotextile that we have at the Oyster Bay site. All right, step 8 is establishing an irrigation plan. And your hedgerow really should plan to have some form of irrigation for the first 2 growing seasons after planting. If you do that fall planting and you have great mulch, it can reduce the amount of irrigation that is needed the first summer. And of course, you want to do a lot less irrigation the next summer, but you're still going to have to plan for watering at some level for a couple of seasons. The other advantage is using our native and water-wise, or what we call the drought-tolerant plants. We call those water-wise, the non-natives. But you also have to be careful when using those that you don't overwater. So planning for wise use of the irrigation in the summer without giving too much water, which creates which encourages surface root growth. Our goal is to irrigate deeply but infrequently, and that way we encourage those roots to develop deeply and be really ready for our ongoing summer drought conditions. So there are many options for irrigation that you can explore, and that is going to be another webinar, as well as the grant programs that can pay for irrigation. So we'll pack that content into a different webinar in the future, or you can take a look at this great chart that we have in the handbook as well. Step 9 is animal exclusion, and most rural settings are going to need some kind of protection against animals of one type or another. So as part of your site assessment, you want to find out who you have to defend your hedgerow against, whether it's deer, mice, moles, voles, bunnies, beavers, or even livestock. And then as part of your installation, you can take steps to mitigate for those particular animals, whether it's a beaver deceiver or a short or a long-term exclusion barrier. You can do these individual cages as temporary exclusion options for your plants until the plants reach a certain height. But sometimes you do just have to fence the area, whether that's permanent or temporary. It's often worth the time to do that to make sure that you haven't wasted all your effort. And there are some sources for paying for the fencing as well as other plant protection devices. Those plant protection devices, there's just so many out there. We discuss them a little bit in the handbook and in the resource section, and kind of give you some tips on where to look for those different exclusion devices, including borrowing them, because they often have you don't need them for very long. You might need them for a few years. And so somebody else has already taken them off, and you can often get them. You can often borrow them from somebody who doesn't need them anymore. And sometimes the natural resource agencies have collected them. We at Native Plant Salvage have some left over from a planting. I'm sure that our nursery manager, Joan, would love to have you borrow some of those plant protection devices from us. So remember that you don't always have to buy things brand new. They can be reused over and over again. So once you have planted, it is time to enjoy your hedgerow and keep it surviving and thriving. And we have a whole chapter in the handbook devoted to step 10, this monitoring, maintenance, and adaptive management, which is your plan for how you will regularly keep an eye on things, how you're going to take care of your plants, and how you're going to make changes over time as conditions change. So as you might guess, step 10 is also a big topic that we're going to devote a future webinar to. Okay, so I feel like we're doing really well on our time. Let's take some questions, and then we can either take a quick stretch, or maybe we can move right into Cameron's time. People can maybe make comments about how they're feeling about that. But let's do some questions first.
Welcome to type in your questions now. We only have 2 comments right now, both from Mary when discussing some of the site lost my
Assessment?
vocabulary.
Prep?
Assessment, yeah, assessment. One was a reminder about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act about nesting bird sites. You have to be
Oh,
careful about existing trees,
yes, good point.
which is a good
Yes.
call. And then SHPOs, State Historic Preservation Officers, love to visit sites and talk about anything that you might find and what you need to do if you find those things like pottery or burials or etc. So that's another good tip.
Yeah, so how are those folks from that department, Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, Mary? Because that's, I think I implied that, that those folks can help you directly. But if it's a different agency, then we need to know that. We need to get that into our resources. So thanks for those tips. And yeah, we're often we forget that there, because we're primarily not talking about getting rid of plants, except for perhaps the invasive species that could in fact impact the depending on the time of year that you do removal of say a thicket of blackberries. It's always possible that there's something nesting in there, so that's important to keep an eye out on that.
Excuse me.
The other thing about that is that often the best timing for getting rid of invasive species is not actually in line with when the nesting season is. So we're often looking at doing that in the late summer, early fall, whereas nesting season is in the spring and early summer. But those are all important things that I think we should make note of and add to the toolkit. What else,
I have a
Cameron?
question from Max Gordon. Do you have experience or recommendations about using tillage radish to deal with compacted soils?
I do not. Jay or Kiana, do you folks know about that?
I do not, Erica. I'm sorry.
Do you have something you can share with us, Max? Is it Max? That's right, isn't it? Max, maybe you can share some more stuff.
Yeah,
Okay.
feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, there's so much to know. And actually, our colleague Patrick Schultz, who's also part of this grant, and many of you maybe have participated in the recent agroforestry work that he's been doing with Kiana and Jay. And there's just so much to this that so many of you know that we don't know about, and that Patrick knows from the agroforestry side that we'd like to incorporate into the hedgerow side. So that's why we're excited that our resources are on the internet and they're living and growing, and we're not kind of locked into anything except for with the handbook where we have kind of the principles, but we can keep adding to those. So as you folks have things to share, we'd love to incorporate those into the resources that everyone can benefit from. Was there another question? Are we ready do folks want to stretch, or should we just power through for the next half hour?
We just have one note from Carissa saying that confirming that using radishes for compacted soil helps break up compaction and build soil nutrients.
Nice.
And Max says they've heard about them, but just haven't used them.
I think there are other crops as well that people use for that. So again, that's where I'm saying, like, so much to learn, so much to know. So share the wealth, please.
All right, shall I go ahead and share my screen, Erica?
I think so. I haven't heard that people are like dying for, I guess if everybody's at home, they can walk around with their computer and stretch if they want to. I'm going to stop my share and let you take it over.
All right. I'm going to do a really quick lightning review of how we lay out our plants, just so visually you sort of know what we're talking about. This is in our last webinar. There'll be a new independent video about drawing these spacing diagrams, and all of this information is in the how-to handbook. But so spacing circles represent our largest plants first. Here we have trees. These trees may have foliage all the way down to the ground or a canopy with room to plant beneath them. So we keep that in mind as we lay out our groups, that these circles are representative of how much space between trees, not necessarily the tree itself. So you can see here, we've laid out medium shrubs. Some are tucked under overlapping trees and overlapping the trees here, but not on the tree that we know has no room. And then smaller shrubs, again, overlap the previous groups, but not each other or the plants that have no room to be overlapped, like that conifer. So here's one of our spacing diagrams from our last hedgerow installation at Helsing Junction. Our goals there included providing shade, a windbreak, and a lot for pollinators. In this block, we even had this herbaceous perennial insectary strip out front, plants chosen and laid out with help from Xerces Society. And these will eventually fill in the gaps between plantings, sort of like Erica pointed out for our upcoming hedgerow. And we planted these, as Erica showed, in this sort of repeating pattern. We were just testing out different types of blocks as we went. Two that we were testing for our hedgerow templates, and a third based on recommendations and funding from a SARE grant. So you can see sort of how they repeat along with breaks in between. In a minute, I'll show this Saturday's planting and how everything from the full layout to the number of templates and the plant choices are all, changed in response to a different site. When you start in on those first steps that Erica mentioned, you're responding to not only the site and your goals, but your budget and availability to plant. So we were able to plant this block on the left last time, but if we'd needed fewer plants over the same length of hedgerow, we could decrease density by increasing the size of the spacing circles. So in the how-to handbook, you will see this recommendation for moderate spacing. You just increase the size of the spacing circles. So here you can see I only had room for 2 trees, 6 large shrubs. And so as you add up the numbers, you get fewer plants, less dense. On Saturday, we'll be planting this hedgerow at Oyster Bay Farm. It's longer and the site conditions are much more variable along the length of the hedgerow, which we'll see show up in the planting plan. So here you can see, rather than repeating blocks in a pattern, these blocks are respondent to the site, whether it's wet or dry, whether it's sunny or shady. In that soil readout that Erica showed, the hedgerow actually is sort of in its own, is pretty consistent soil along the hedgerow, with the fields on either side being a little different. Went too far. Unlike Helsing, where we had those three templates, here you can see the lower portion is all very wet. So we're planting, the one type of block here. Over here we have a little more shade, so that's a wet but shady block. We're trying out something on its own up here in this little purple stretch. The dry section is more shaded, and the row on the right will eventually be even more shady because the row on the left in that sunny portion will shade out this side further because of the site's orientation. So that whole list of things Erica was talking about that you're thinking about, your orientation, where the wind's coming from, soil conditions, water conditions, sun conditions, all show up here. So rather than laying out your plants all along the whole length of the hedgerow and designing it all in one fell swoop, which would be a lot of work, we recommend creating these blocks that can be used over and over. But one challenge when repeating a block this many times is that one plant added to that block means that it's added to every iteration of that block. So here I throw in a cluster rose into this wet and sunny block here, and that means 21 roses appear along the length of that section of the hedgerow right away. This increases the numbers and price drastically for each plant that you add. So when you're ordering plants in bulk, there are lots of little edits to make to get the numbers within those rounded purchasing numbers required by some nurseries. We talk about this, including changing the stock type, for example, like Erica mentioned, from potted to bare root plants to save money, in our budgeting videos and resources on the site. So I would check those out for a lot more detail. Here we have 6 different blocks that we're planting on Saturday, with the plant selection of each responding to something about the site. So again, you can see here these double teal are our sunny and sunny but wet section. The teal and blue is a sunny and shady section, but still wet. We have a little patch here that's shady and wet after the second break in the hedgerows, and then we get into some drier sections, but pretty shady sections. So the plant choices that we choose for each of these blocks respond to that. We wanted to incorporate an evergreen backbone, but we were limited by what would do well in that wet portion, and that takes up over 2/3 of the hedgerow. So we chose Pacific wax myrtle for that situation, spacing it equally. You can see these diagonals. So if this were to repeat, you'd have sort of a zigzag of evergreen plant going down this entire section. that would do well in that wet area. The dry section enters the wooded area up here where there's little sun. So we wanted to pack in anything that needs more sunlight, like the red flowering currant, strawberry tree, mock orange, into the few places here where we know we would have a little more sun. And in general, we were using plants that are more adaptable because the site is going to change. As I said earlier, this, as it grows, is actually going to shade itself over time. So these are just very specific details that, if we go back and look at this whole plan, came up as we went. I made some calculation errors, so I had to go back and tweak some of these. And again, it's a lot easier to throw in spirea here into this template that's only repeated 3 times here, because adding 1 spirea actually means 3. Whereas in these double teal areas, every plant we add is multiplied by 21. So it's a lot trickier. The longer your hedgerow is, the more you have a repeating template to get your calculations right. There's lots of play, variability. I was kind of co-designing in a graphics program as well as inside of Excel with Erica's help and plant selection help. And if you come on Saturday, we'll be really talking a lot more as we plant each of these and go along the hedgerow, why we chose these plants, how much we were able to squeeze them in. You'll see some things like over here in the shady dry area, we have plants going right up under this maple because that maple form is going to allow for that, versus other plants that have a shrubby to the ground form and don't really allow us to plant as densely as we'd like. You'll also see snowberry packed in here all over the place. That's really easy with bare root or live stakes with snowberry, to just use it cheaply to fill in all along your hedgerow. Erica, is there anything else you want to say while I have this Saturday template up?
Sure. I think I'm demuted. Yeah, I mean, the point too about those little ones is that one thing I didn't say in my little definition of hedgerow, which we talked about extensively in the first webinar, is that we're really going for a layered approach to this, because that's our bias, coming from an ecological restoration background and also green stormwater, where the more layers you have, the more water you intercept, and the more filtering you can achieve, but also the more habitat value there is. So like snowberry it's a great plant for pollinators, and B, it does spread by rhizomes, so it keeps making more of itself. So that's another way that's one that's pretty cheap. And also the roses and the thimbleberries. A lot of those smaller rhizomatous shrubs are great for filling in. They'll fill in at the lower levels. They'll just kind of go where they can go. And if they run up against a tree that they shouldn't go, they're not going to be competing for resources against the bigger plants. I guess that's the main thing, while they're also performing a lot of wildlife habitat value and, again, water resources value. But the other goals too, where we have to have where you're trying to block dust or wind or whatever, you really want those layers all the way down. So that's the other thing I'd say. And then the other thing, if you can just go back to the wet area, I just want to say that same idea that you were talking about, because I'm not sharing my screen. So the dark blue line in the back of the wet area, that's not, keep going, sorry, right there. Yeah, that is not necessarily very shady at all right now, but it's the concept is that it will be more shady later, because the lines in front of it are going to be providing some shade. But in all of those lines, the plants that we have, particularly in the shadier sections, they're really resilient. They're going to be fine in the sun right now, and they're going to be fine in a little bit more shade later on too. It's never going to be full on shade in that section. Whereas I do think up at the top, where it's already sort of only partly sunny, that back line might have quite a bit more shade. Yeah, the orange line versus the yellow line. The yellow line is in front, and it's going to really shade out the orange line, which is already backed up against the edge of the forest there.
Yeah, these are out in sort of the bare field, and this whole section is between, in a gap sort of in the woods. So just a very different section of the site.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. If you want to keep going on your...
No, you're welcome to steal back the share.
Okay. I don't have a whole lot. Wow, I can't believe this. This is, I always try to do too much. Everybody should know. They're like, this was so short. But the truth is that I'm always usually running, uh, are we there? Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yep.
I'm usually trying to pack too much in, so I'm trying to learn in my old age and not be so and just realize like, yeah, there will be another opportunity. And that's what I love about this series is that we don't have to cover it all right now. We can cover it more later too. So again, I just wanted to remind folks of what we're going to be doing on Saturday. So Cameron's kind of laid out the different areas, but I just will sort of show you here that we have these wet areas along here. And then you can see we go up into the woods, and that funny little area that's a bit of an experiment is along another adjunct of the stream. So this stream kind of runs through here, but also comes down here too. So whoops, sorry. So there's a lot of water coming across this, a lot of opportunities to intercept. Because Nate and Melissa have sheep, goats, and chickens. Right now the chickens are kind of tucked away safely in one of these barns for the winter. Which one is it? I think here or here. I can't quite tell from the overview. Can everybody see my cursor? Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, great. But in the summertime, once the weather turns, these chickens are kind of all around here, and in their chicken tractor, so that's really full free range animals for both eggs and for meat chickens. So great animals if you're interested in buying eggs or roasters, very healthy. But as I said before, their manures will be on these fields. Now, unfortunately, we don't have as many rains in the winter time or in the summertime. But regardless, the goal is to have this completely protected essentially with these filtering plants so that as runoff, as nutrients come down, as pathogens potentially come down, that we're able to interrupt them. The other thing that we're going to be doing after we plant is the mulching I talked about before, but I think the planting is going to be taking us some time given how long it is. And we will have some interesting tools to try to make quick work of some of the bare root plants, particularly the ones with smaller roots. Just to kind of follow up what Cameron just showed, I want to show you this really quickly. This is the wet section plant list, and this is the dry section plant list. And you can see here just how limited we are on the evergreen backbone shrubs. So we did have a handful of Sitka spruces here, which we may or may not actually be putting out there. We've pretty much defaulted to using more of the Pacific wax myrtle just to keep things simple for now. But those are the really only two that we're going to work for this particular site. So you can see how limiting that is, having that be so saturated versus over here, we're up in the forest in the dry area. And we've got 3 nice big shrubs that we can use. And of course, plenty more too, but we actually get a little bit shaded out up there. And there's just a limit to how much we need up in that area. So this is the dry section group of plants, and this is the wet section, some of which overlap, but mostly we have a lot of water-loving plants or water-tolerant plants here. They would also be fine elsewhere. The only other finally, and I'm happy to answer questions about that is if folks have questions specifically about the plant list, is on the Hedgerows website, there is this Get Involved tab, and you can go there and you can fill out a form. And we say stay connected. Maybe some of you have done that, and you got my email that I sent last Friday night, I think, reminding you that you had this opportunity. So we'll try to keep people apprised of upcoming events if you fill out the Get Involved, and we'll keep sending you reminders about new events that we're going to have, hands-on or webinars or new resources coming out or whatever they might be. So with that, I think we'd like to take final questions.
We just had one that I answered from Mary. She said, not recognizing any native grasses or clovers. Are you not using them? And I mentioned that we just had so much to pack into our handbook, we stopped before we even got to graminoids or herbaceous perennials. Our plant table and templates all sort of like end with woodies, with the exception of that insectary strip from the last installation, which was sort of from a partner's partnership. But that an addition in the future and or our website's resources will definitely have more information about, native and water-wise ground covers. But we just sort of capped it off.
We ran out of time.
We ran out of time. The book kept growing and growing, and we had to call it somewhere.
Yeah, we were
Um,
actually we started we actually have some draft Cameron has some draft drawings done where we like for that filtration strip for the water quality, and of course he did do the pollinator strip. So we'll be including those later on as we start to get more of these under our belt. But that's a great question, and it's not as though we're trying to neglect it. That's why we talk about it in the handbook, because eventually we will have some resources for folks on those topics. Definitely. Thanks. Great question.
We can point you toward the resources on Native Plant Salvage website. Lots of things there. There's a whole section on lawn replacement, native ground covers, pollinator herbaceous perennial choices, all sorts of things there. We just don't have it overlapping with hedgerows just yet.
Yeah, and some of it, particularly like this site here, there's already a lot of graminoids that are going to be in there. Even with the woody plants, there's going to always be graminoids on that site. So sometimes when you have the right conditions, the plants will already be there. Sorry, by this site question. Here, I meant Oyster Bay. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, but we have an anonymous question about, are there similar hedgerow programs in Pierce County, and how does one volunteer a site?
Oh, well, in the fall, we partnered, in addition to Thurston Conservation District, we were lucky enough to also partner with Pierce Conservation District. Now, they are doing some different templates, but we're all really excited to be sharing wisdom and experiences. And they did have a grant from Western SARE, and I believe that they had all their sites figured out for that, but they might be going after some more. So we're going to encourage you to contact Pierce Conservation District, and specifically you want to talk to Allie Nichols. And if you need contact information from her, you can connect with us afterwards, but I'm sure you can find it on the Pierce Conservation District website, and let her know of your interest in that. But we also would be happy to help support your efforts to the extent that we can, and certainly the NRCS folks are providing support across the regions. But I guess our approach is a little different. We talked about that a bit in the first webinar, and Kiana asked us that question in the podcast, and we talked about kind of our approach is a lot more densely packed, a lot more layered than traditional agricultural hedgerows in this region are.
And then we just have a comment from Roberta saying this is exciting. They're learning a lot and planting a very small hedgerow themselves, which is great.
Oh, excellent. Oh, the other thing I'm going to say about that is that I'm hoping in 2025 that one of my funding sources will support us doing some more residential scale hedgerow work, maybe with an HOA, or like more of a smaller scale project that is less agriculturally focused and more focused on issues of privacy or screening or water quality protection, those kinds of things that are more relevant to homeowners. Of course, wildlife and all of that too. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to do more of that.
One of my on the list of tweaks and new templates we want to have up, we want to have a sort of miniature version, maybe a lawn-sized version of our close to home template, made a little closer to Erica's dimensions, around 8 foot or even slimmer, and what you should think through when planting that. We'd like to at least have one example up on the site.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay, the only thing I was going to say is that we are hoping to send out some follow-up emails to folks later on, both about the planting project and the webinar, just to work on improving and making the resources more meaningful and useful for you over time. So I hope if you get that email that you will give us some feedback when it comes. It's not going to be right away. So maybe if you've got some thoughts right now about ideas that we could things that you liked and things you didn't like, or ways to improve, either send us an email or write it down so that when you get your evaluation, you can share that feedback anonymously. Anything else, Jay and Kiana, would you like to share anything before we say goodnight to folks? I think we're ending. Oh my gosh, it's 7:29 by my watch.
Just a big thank you, Erica, to both you and Cameron for being here and presenting all this awesome information.
Well, thank you for being such great partners, and we're hoping to see a whole lot of you on Saturday. You don't have to be physically active to help us out. There's a lot of things to be done with just like reading the plan and listening and learning and taking pictures and all kinds of stuff. So come if you can. And we have the mantra, come when you can, stay as long as you like. So it says 9 to 3, but you don't have to come all day.
And it's going to be beautiful weather.
Oh gosh,
So
maybe
it's gonna be outside.
a little too beautiful, maybe. Who knows?
Gosh, I know. I was like, oh my gosh, am I going to have to take off layers? It looks like it's going to be a really, really good day. So excited about that.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.